I've noticed with this ancestral movement towards nutrition that paleo is making a little bit of a comeback, but it's not really called paleo anymore. It's a little bit more just ancestral, which really is kind of what paleo was after in the first place. Now, this entire video is based upon one particular study that compared paleo to fasting to a Mediterranean diet. And it only covered one real sliver of things that we need to talk about. So from that study, we'll be able to branch out a little bit more and understand which philosophy makes the most sense for you, which one is best, although I don't know if there is a best diet, but let's break it down. Now, this study was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it had subjects follow a traditional sort of fasting approach, where in this particular case, they were kind of intermittent fasting. And they had another group follow a more strict Mediterranean approach. In this case, it was actually a pretty low protein Mediterranean diet, moderate fat, decent amount of carbohydrates coming from lentils and grains and the usual kind of Mediterranean stuff, not as much from, say, fruit as I would have liked. And then there was a paleo style diet. Now, I'm going to pause for 1 second and describe a little bit about paleo. Now, I'm not a paleo expert, okay, but I know enough about it. The idea behind paleo was to live sort of as close to the earth as possible in a way that our ancestors would, right? So you're eating all cuts of meat, like you're eating saturated fat, you're probably even getting some gristle, things like that. You're leaning into the fruits, you're getting rid of anything refined or artificial. So you could eat some vegetables, although most of the vegetables that you would probably eat would probably be like tubers, maybe some sweet potatoes, maybe things like that. Now, nuts, these were all realistic as well. However, there's some holes that we could poke in this, because I think in a real Paleolithic sense, although nuts and seeds were probably consumed, they were probably consumed in very small amounts. And most of the people that I know that have done paleo were getting a large majority of their calories from nuts and seeds, which again, I have no problem with nuts and seeds, but I don't think it's historically accurate to be eating that much, because it's a process to actually get a nut and a seed out. So maybe you would be eating them in a small amount that you could harvest, right? That's my opinion, doesn't really matter. This study was interesting because they were looking specifically at HbA1c. Now, HbA1c is a tremendous marker to look at when you're looking at metabolic health. Now, as of 2018, by the way, 93% of Americans were considered metabolically unhealthy. That doesn't mean that they were obese. That doesn't mean that they had all kinds of comorbidities. It just means that at a mitochondrial level, at various metabolic levels, they were considered metabolically unhealthy. Hopefully things are improving because we're learning more there. The reason that I mention this is that at the very core of metabolic health is our ability to use substrates, fuel, glucose, fats, the ability to switch between the two, right? How is our glucose tolerance? When we consume sugar, can we actually utilize it, or does it spike our glucose high because we have an inability to process it right? That all matters. So when you look at HbA1c, you look at the 90-day sort of indicator of how much glucose has been circulating and impacting cells and tissues, and in this case, glycosylated hemoglobin. How is it actually affecting the hemoglobin? What they found is that after 1 full year of fairly strict adherence to these diets, fasting reduced HbA1c by 0.2%. That's not bad, but the fasting group was really able to kind of eat whatever they wanted to, right? The Mediterranean group had a 0.8% reduction in HbA1c. That's actually quite good. The paleo group also had a 0.2%. So paleo and fasting ended up around the same amount. Now, again, there is definitely some scrutiny that can be had there. We could dial into those more. The Mediterranean seemed to fare the best. Now, I'm kind of curious as to why this is, because if you analyze the diets and you look at other studies that look at Mediterranean, you find that Mediterranean does do really, really well when it comes down to glucose modulation, but it seems to do so by working upon a different axis than, say, fasting or paleo would, right? Fasting probably reduces glucose simply by abstinence, like you're abstaining from food, so putting yourself in a severe calorically restricted state, you're going to what's called phosphorylate AMPK. So basically you're turning on a signal that says, we're in a caloric deficit that's pretty extreme. So you need to like mobilize tissues, you need to mobilize lipids and fats and whatever. And that is going to trigger a series of different cascades that happen as a result. Okay, with a Mediterranean diet, it's much more about the addition of things, whereas fasting is more about the removal of things. With the Mediterranean, you're usually adding things in. You're adding the monounsaturated fats that have a tremendous impact. You're adding the lean proteins, which have an impact. You're adding polyphenols, which have a tremendous impact. You're adding fiber. So one of the things that Mediterranean offers that maybe paleo is not so much is a higher fiber content. Right? Because even a well-crafted paleo diet might not have a whole lot of, say, the resistant starches that are going to come from sweet potatoes, even though they're allowed, right? Whereas a Mediterranean diet, you find a lot of those kinds of foods. Now, it makes you wonder, okay, is the gut microbiome at play here? Why did Mediterranean fare so well? I'm inclined to think it does have to do with our gut health. So much of things stem from the gut, right? And polyphenols, which are going to be in the fruits that we consume, in the vegetables that we consume, these are considered fibers in and of themselves. They are fibers that fuel the microbiome and allow them to proliferate and allow those particular bacteria and those strains of bacteria to grow. Now, full disclaimer, I think there's a lot more to the microbiome than we even begin to pretend to know. But I do think that it plays a big part in our glucose modulation, because the more that our bacteria are diverse, the more short chain fatty acids that we can produce. Now, what that means is those are a byproduct of the bacteria fermenting food and fibers and whatnot in our gut. They produce these short chain fatty acids that then signal for our cells to operate in certain ways. They orchestrate a lot. That is exactly why there's such a push for a lot of kind of garbage probiotics and stuff out there. And I say that because a lot of them are. I think it's a lot better to pay attention to fiber and culture your own microbiome than it is to try to just take a supplement to counteract a bad diet. I put a link down below for the probiotic that I would use. It's the only one that I literally would ever recommend. It's called Seed. It is a synbiotic, which has a capsule inside of a capsule. So it has a prebiotic and a probiotic. So whatever diet you are doing, if you are trying to contribute to a better microbiome, I would highly, highly recommend it. They also put their money where their mouth is with research, and that's a 25% off discount link off that daily synbiotic. So 25% off, you can try it out. One thing that I've noticed with it is that although it does improve my digestion, that's not what I'm after with it. I notice personally, anecdotally, improvements in my mood, improvements in my sleep when I'm consistently taking it. Now, I noticed an improvement within a couple of days if I hadn't been taking it, and I usually notice it pretty quickly if I stop taking it. So regardless of what you choose to do, you can skip through this section or whatever, but that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video. I want to unpack a little bit more about fasting for a second, because fasting versus paleo itself could be really interesting. Arguably, one of the reasons that paleo works so well for people is because you're eating in a way that is so not processed that you're allowing your satiety signals to naturally operate the way that they should. Now, what that means is that you're eating close to the earth, your body's not going to be bombarded with as many signals from ultra-processed food that are encouraging you to eat more than you really need. So in theory, if you come back down to that kind of whole earth thing, protein, tubers, vegetables, fruit, nuts, it makes sense that you're not going to be as hungry because you're fully satiated. So in theory, you could eat in a caloric deficit. But there was a study that was published in Nature Medicine that compared fasting for 20 hours, 3 days per week. Okay, so 3 days per week, they would eat between the hours of 8 a.m. and 12 p.m. Okay, now what they would do after that is fast for 20 hours, and then a couple days later, they would do it again. So collectively, they ended up fasting 3 days per week. Okay, that's it, just 3 days per week for 20 hours. And that was it. The other group was a 30% caloric restriction diet, where every day they restricted calories by 30%. Okay, so it was 70% of their total energy needs. And the third group was sort of a standardized diabetes control diet, like to just kind of help with like lower glycemic, et cetera, et cetera. Now the fasting group still reduced calories. They reduced calories by 70% on the days they fasted, but that kind of goes without saying because you're only eating for 4 hours, so it's easy to be in a caloric deficit. What they found with this was after 2, 6, and 12 months, the fasting group was the only group to have a significant change in their glucose levels and their HbA1c. So even though they were arguably eating just as much as the caloric restriction group, they had better improvements. Now, if you were to say combine fasting with paleo, that would be an even better sort of ancestral type of diet, right? Because it makes sense that we would go periods of time without eating. That makes a lot of sense. Like, okay, we hunt, we get a kill, and then we fast for a while until we get our next kill, and we gather for a little bit, and it's kind of this mix match. So paleo and fasting go hand in hand. But one thing that we don't seem to think about is how we can stack the various benefits. We're so focused on how do we get the benefits of Mediterranean? How do we get the benefits of fasting? How do we get the benefits of paleo? But we're not really thinking about how we can apply all the benefits of each. In essence, you could do a paleo version of Mediterranean. You absolutely could. You could say, okay, Mediterranean uses lean proteins, uses olive oils, uses these things. How do you apply that in a paleo sense? You eat the lean meats, maybe you eat the whole olives, you still eat the nuts, you still eat the fatty fish, you still eat the vegetables. The only thing you're doing is you're not eating the grains as much, right? Paleo is not too hot on the grains. So with Mediterranean, you'd reduce the rices, you'd reduce the lentils, you'd reduce these things and you'd replace them with, say, sweet potatoes, or maybe with the occasional other kind of tuber, or maybe a squash, or something like that. If you really think about it, overlapping paleo and Mediterranean, and living in a Mediterranean ancestral diet, I say that with quotes because it's kind of cheesy, that would make a lot of sense. And combining that with fasting could work even better. So paleo implies that you eat sort of these big fatty cuts of meat all the time. And I have some issues with that because fattier cuts of meat are going to be a higher level of saturated fat, which isn't necessarily good for metabolic health. Contrary to what a lot of people say, the science and the literature that is out there refutes that. And as much as I hate to say it, because I love my fatty cuts of ribeye, I look where the science is and I kind of go that direction. So leaner cuts of meat would make more sense on paleo, which would mean you'd have to get fats from sort of other sources, maybe more in the way of some nuts, in the way of some avocados, in the way of some olives. But it's food for thought. Instead of taking a stance with a diet tribe, we can overlap and stack the benefits. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.